A spoon trembled in the hand of Untersturmführer Wilhelm Hoffmann as he stared at the meal before him on that scorching June afternoon in 1943. The Texas sun beat down through the windows of the newly constructed mess hall at Camp Hearn, casting long shadows across rows of wooden tables where nearly 2,000 German prisoners of war sat frozen in collective disbelief. What lay before Hoffmann on that standard-issue American military tray seemed impossible, almost like a cruel joke designed to break what remained of his spirit. A steaming bowl of beef stew, rich and fragrant, with actual chunks of meat larger than his entire weekly ration back in Rommel's Afrika Korps. Vegetables, fresh and colorful, not the rotting scraps or desert weeds he had grown accustomed to during those final desperate months in Tunisia. Beside it, a thick slice of soft white bread that contained real wheat instead of the sawdust fillers that had become standard in German military rations. And next to the bread, perhaps most impossibly of all, a tall glass of cold milk that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, condensation beading on its surface like something from a half-forgotten dream of peacetime. This is a story about the most unexpected weapon in the Second World War, a weapon that didn't explode or kill, but instead nourished and transformed. It's a story about how abundance defeated ideology, how the simple act of feeding enemy soldiers became one of the most powerful forms of propaganda ever deployed. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable chapter of World War II history, if you're fascinated by these untold stories from the Second World War, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I love hearing from history enthusiasts around the world. Now, let's step back in time to understand how a plate of food could shatter the iron certainty of Nazi belief. Wilhelm Hoffmann was 24 years old that summer, though the hardships of North Africa had aged him beyond his years. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, swept up in the fervor of German victories across Europe, believing absolutely in the superiority of the German soldier, the German system, the German future. He had marched through France in 1940, feeling invincible as the French armies crumbled before the German blitzkrieg. He had shipped to North Africa in early 1941, part of the legendary Deutsches Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. For 2 years, Hoffmann had fought in the sands of Libya and Egypt, enduring heat, dust, and increasingly desperate supply shortages. He had watched as British forces pushed them back, as American troops joined the fight, as the once mighty Afrika Korps began to wither not primarily from enemy action, but from starvation. That final spring in Tunisia had been a nightmare of deprivation. The Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean had been severed by Allied air and naval superiority. Ships that tried to reach North Africa were sunk with devastating regularity. What little food made it through was barely enough to keep men conscious, let alone fighting. Hoffmann had grown accustomed to the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the weakness in his limbs, the way his uniform hung loose on his frame. When the surrender came in May 1943, when over 275,000 Axis troops laid down their weapons, many of them could barely stand. Hoffmann weighed just 128 pounds, down from his pre-war weight of 170. His teeth were loose from scurvy, his vision blurred at night from vitamin A deficiency. He was, in every sense, a broken man. Now sitting in this mess hall in Texas, staring at more food than he had seen in months, Wilhelm Hoffmann thought this had to be propaganda, a psychological operation designed to demoralize them further. He wrote to his mother in Hamburg that evening, though the letter wouldn't arrive until 6 months later, delayed by wartime censorship and the chaos of transatlantic mail. His words were careful, aware that censors might read them, but his confusion bled through every sentence. "They are showing us propaganda food," he wrote in neat German script. "Tomorrow it will be turnip water like everyone else. How could I believe otherwise? No nation at war could feed its enemies like kings while its own people surely starve. This must be a trick, mutter. I will write again when I discover the truth." Around Hoffmann in that cavernous mess hall, the scene repeated itself 2,000 times over. Veterans of North Africa, men who had conquered France and pushed deep into Russia, men who had driven the British back to El Alamein before the tide finally turned, sat paralyzed before their trays. Some wept openly, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust still embedded in their sun-darkened skin. Others sat frozen, unable to move their forks, unable to reconcile the abundance spread before them with 3 years of Nazi propaganda that had painted America as a weak, decadent nation, divided by class warfare and racial strife, collapsing under the weight of a war it could never win. They had been told that Americans were soft, that their industrial capacity was exaggerated, that their will to fight would crumble under pressure. They had been assured that Germany would triumph because Germans were simply superior, harder, more disciplined, destined for victory. What Wilhelm Hoffmann and his fellow prisoners did not yet understand was that they were looking directly into the beating heart of American strength. They were witnessing the agricultural and industrial might of a country that had transformed itself into what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. This was a nation that not only fed its own 12 million men under arms, scattered across every continent and ocean, but also shipped more than 17 million tons of food aid to its allies in Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free France. American farms, mechanized to a degree unimaginable in Europe, produced such staggering surpluses that feeding enemy prisoners well was not a burden, but barely a rounding error in the vast calculations of American logistics. To men who had been starving, who had watched comrades die from malnutrition as surely as from bullets, the food alone was more powerful than any speech, more convincing than any propaganda leaflet dropped from Allied bombers. It was the first crack in the iron certainty of Nazi ideology, and that crack would only widen in the months and years to come. To truly grasp the psychological and physical impact this abundance had on German prisoners like Wilhelm Hoffmann, we need to understand in granular detail what they were coming from, the systematic deprivation that had become the daily reality of life in Nazi Germany, and especially in its armed forces. By 1943, Germany's elaborate rationing system, which had been introduced with great fanfare at the start of the war as a model of efficiency, had collapsed into overlapping layers of deprivation that affected every level of society. The promise that Germans would not suffer the starvation of World War I, when British blockades had led to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, had proven hollow. Despite the conquest of vast agricultural regions in Eastern Europe, despite the ruthless extraction of resources from occupied territories, Germany simply could not feed its people adequately while fighting a multi-front war of unprecedented scale. German civilians in 1943 survived on rations that ranged from 1,500 to 1,700 calories per day if they were fortunate enough to receive their full allotment, which was increasingly rare. But these figures tell only part of the story. The quality of food had deteriorated catastrophically as the war ground on. Bread, the staple of the German diet, was no longer made from wheat flour alone, but from a mixture that often contained 30 to 40% sawdust, ground straw, or other indigestible fillers. Potatoes, when available, were often rotten or diseased. Meat became a luxury seen once or twice a month, and even then it was frequently horse meat or worse. Butter had been replaced by margarine made from coal derivatives that tasted bitter and provided little nutritional value. Coffee was ersatz, made from roasted acorns or chicory. Sugar, eggs, milk, all the basic components of normal nutrition, had become precious commodities available only to the well-connected or those willing to risk the black market. The psychological impact of this sustained deprivation cannot be overstated. German families organized their entire existence around the acquisition and preparation of inadequate food. Women spent hours each day standing in queues, hoping that supplies would last until their turn came. Children grew up knowing constant hunger as normal. The Nazi leadership, aware that civilian morale depended significantly on adequate nutrition, had tried to maintain food supplies by ruthlessly stripping occupied territories, particularly in Eastern Europe, where millions of people were deliberately starved to feed the German war machine. Yet even this criminal policy could not make up for the fundamental problem that Germany lacked the agricultural capacity and, increasingly, the transportation infrastructure to feed both its civilian population and its millions of soldiers scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. For soldiers at the front, The situation was theoretically better but often worse in practice. Wehrmacht troops were promised 3,600 calories per day, a generous allotment on paper designed to sustain men engaged in the extraordinary physical demands of modern warfare. Officers and planners had calculated precise requirements, factoring in the energy expenditure of marching, digging, fighting, and surviving in harsh conditions, but the reality at the front, especially as the war turned against Germany after 1942, rarely matched these official figures. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles were vulnerable to partisan attacks, Allied bombing, and simple logistical breakdown. By the time food reached frontline units, if it reached them at all, it was often spoiled, reduced in quantity, or of such poor quality that men could barely stomach it. In North Africa, where most of the prisoners now sitting in Camp Hearn had been captured, the situation had become catastrophic in those final months. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, the elite force that had seemed unstoppable in 1941 and early 1942, had been slowly starved into ineffectiveness. British and American control of the Mediterranean had made supplying Rommel's forces a near impossible task. Ships carrying vital supplies were sunk with devastating regularity. Those that made it through could not carry enough to sustain an army fighting in one of the harshest environments on earth. One German soldier, Feldwebel Kurt Müller, kept a meticulous diary throughout his service in North Africa, maintaining his entries even as conditions deteriorated around him. His last entry, written on May 11, 1943, just days before his capture, provides a stark window into the desperation of those final weeks. "Division meal today," Müller wrote in a hand that shook with weakness. 150 grams of black bread, mostly sawdust as far as I can tell. Chewing it is like eating sand. 15 grams of margarine, rancid and grey. The soup was made from one potato and whatever dessert weeds our cook could gather. It tasted like dirt and salt. The Italians in the next sector have nothing at all. I saw them yesterday, just shadows sitting in their positions. They don't even have the strength to dig anymore. We are eating our horses. Today I helped butcher the last one in our unit. I used to know his name. I think it was Maximilian. We joked about it, naming a horse after the emperor. Now he's gone, and we have perhaps 4 days of meat if we stretch it. After that, I don't know. Some men are talking about surrender, not because they fear the enemy, but because they can't keep fighting on empty stomachs. I am so tired, so hungry. If I close my eyes, I dream of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her bread baking, the thick stews she made. That life seems like it happened to someone else. Kurt Müller was captured 2 days after writing that entry. He weighed 118 pounds at the time of his surrender, down from his enlistment weight of 163 pounds. Like thousands of others, he could barely walk. The once proud divisions of Rommel's Afrika Korps had been reduced to skeletal shadows, an army destroyed not primarily by superior Allied tactics or firepower, though those certainly played their part, but by the simple inability to maintain supply lines across a contested sea. Medical officers who examined German prisoners as they surrendered documented the extent of the health crisis. Widespread scurvy was evident in bleeding gums, loose teeth, and wounds that refused to heal. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency meant soldiers literally could not see to fight after sunset. Swollen legs and feet from protein starvation made marching impossible. Digestive systems, accustomed to near-starvation rations, had begun to fail. Many prisoners suffered from chronic dysentery, their bodies unable to extract nutrients from what little food they received. German soldiers were collapsing not from bullets, but from malnutrition, and this reality would fundamentally shape their perception of what they encountered in American captivity. The shock of American abundance began even before the prisoners reached the continental United States. At temporary collection points established in North Africa immediately after the surrender, American quartermasters, following explicit orders to treat prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, began distributing K-rations. These were the same field rations that American soldiers themselves carried, compact meals designed for troops in combat situations. American GIs often complained about K-rations, finding them monotonous and uninspiring compared to hot meals from field kitchens. They griped about the crackers, the canned meat, the powdered coffee, But to German prisoners who had been subsisting on sawdust bread and weed soup, K-rations were nothing short of miraculous. Each K-ration box contained approximately 3,000 calories worth of food, carefully balanced to provide carbohydrates, protein, fats, and essential vitamins. There were crackers that weren't moldy, several varieties depending on the meal type. A tin of meat that was actually meat, whether it was chopped ham and eggs for breakfast, processed cheese for lunch, or beef stew for dinner. Chocolate bars, real sugar, processed glucose tablets for quick energy, even cigarettes and matches. One prisoner, writing home weeks later, described the first K-ration he received with something approaching religious awe. They apologized, he wrote, still unable to believe the memory. The American soldier who handed me the box apologized. He said this was all they had available at the moment, that we would get hot meals soon. Apologized for giving us more food than I had seen in weeks. I ate everything in that box, even the cigarettes at first because I thought they might be food I didn't recognize. The chocolate made me cry. I had forgotten what chocolate tasted like. The cultural shock deepened during the transatlantic voyage. German prisoners were packed into Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that had become the workhorses of American logistics. These ships were not designed for comfort, and conditions for prisoners were crowded, hot, and uncomfortable during the week-long crossing. But even in these circumstances, the prisoners began to notice something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of the war. American sailors, the young men tasked with guarding them and operating the ship, treated food with a casual disregard that bordered on the incomprehensible to Germans who had known years of deprivation. Prisoners, desperate and still operating on the scarcity mindset that had governed their lives for so long, fought each other to access the ship's garbage. They quickly learned when refuse was thrown overboard and would position themselves nearby, hoping to retrieve something, anything edible. What they found in that garbage shocked them more than any propaganda film could have. American sailors were throwing away whole loaves of bread, tossing them into the Atlantic without a second thought because they had gone slightly stale. Pieces of chicken, fully cooked and perfectly edible, discarded because a sailor didn't like dark meat. Chocolate bars crushed underfoot because someone had stepped on them and they had melted in the tropical heat, the sailors simply opening a fresh bar rather than dealing with the mess. Apples with minor bruises thrown overboard by the dozen. Half-eaten sandwiches tossed aside. The Germans began to grasp a terrifying truth. If America could waste this much food, if its ordinary sailors could discard what would have been priceless treasure in Germany, then its productive capacity was beyond anything Nazi propaganda had prepared them to understand. One prisoner, Herbert Schultz, a former tank commander who had fought from Poland to Tunisia, later described the psychological impact of those garbage runs. "We thought we understood America," he recalled in an interview decades after the war. "We had been told they were weak, that they couldn't produce, that their society was falling apart. But when I saw an American throw away more food than my family would have had in a week, when I saw them discard things we would have fought over, I began to realize that everything we had been told was a lie. They weren't suffering. They weren't weak. They were so strong, so rich in resources, that they could afford to waste more than we could afford to use." That was when I first felt fear, real fear, about what we had challenged. Then the ships reached Norfolk, Virginia, and the prisoners experienced their first sustained view of the American home front. Being unloaded from the ships, weak and disoriented, many still unable to believe they weren't going to be executed or enslaved as Nazi propaganda had warned, the Germans watched the dock workers with fascination. Many of these workers were women, their hair tied back in colorful scarves, wearing trousers and work shirts, operating cranes and forklifts with practiced efficiency. Many others were African Americans, the very people Nazi racial ideology had declared subhuman, unfit for anything but slavery. Yet here they were, unloading ships piled with war material, working with heavy machinery, and casually munching on thick sandwiches during their breaks, drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, stubbing out half-smoked cigarettes, and throwing away those bottles without a second thought. The contrast with what they had been taught about America was staggering. There was no evidence of collapse, no sign of social disintegration. Instead, they saw a society mobilized for war, but not starving, not desperate, not clinging to survival. At the medical processing stations established to evaluate the prisoners' health before transport to permanent camps, the Germans received something that seemed utterly impossible within their framework of understanding. They were given vitamin supplements, pills and tablets designed to treat their malnutrition, their scurvy, their various deficiencies. Enemy soldiers, men who had fought to destroy America and everything it stood for, were being medically treated better than German civilians back home, better than many Wehrmacht soldiers still fighting. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some prisoners assumed this was temporary, that once they were processed and sent to work camps, the real treatment would begin, the brutality and starvation they had been told to expect. Others began to wonder if perhaps they had been lied to about more than just this. The train journey from Norfolk to Texas served as a mobile education in American abundance, a journey that would take several days and cross nearly 2,000 miles of American heartland. The prisoners were kept under guard, but the trains had windows, and through those windows they witnessed a landscape that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Rolling through the Shenandoah Valley, prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, mouths hanging open in disbelief. They saw endless orchards, apple trees heavy with ripening fruit, peach groves, pear trees. They saw herds of cattle, fat and healthy, more cows in a single pasture than entire districts in Bavaria could claim. They passed dairies with dozens, sometimes hundreds of dairy cows, facilities that processed more milk in a day than small German cities would see in a month. Small towns appeared and disappeared, each one a revelation. Grocery stores with windows stacked full of goods, displays of canned food, fresh produce, cuts of meat hanging in butcher shop windows. Restaurants advertising daily specials on hand-painted signs. Ice cream parlors with customers lined up outside on warm afternoons. Families eating frozen treats as casually as if such luxuries were normal. Gas stations where automobiles, privately owned automobiles, lined up for fuel. The prisoners knew gasoline was rationed in America. Propaganda had told them that much. But what they saw suggested rationing at a level of abundance Germany could only dream of. Cars were everywhere, not the handful of official vehicles that dominated German streets, but thousands upon thousands of private automobiles, suggesting a level of prosperity and oil access that made German fuel shortages look catastrophic by comparison. The message was inescapable, hammered home with every mile of track. America had so much food, so much production, so much of everything that it seemed limitless. More importantly, this abundance appeared to extend to every level of society. The prisoners saw black Americans, whom they had been taught to despise as racial inferiors, driving trucks, working in fields with modern equipment, eating meals from lunch pails during breaks. They saw women not just working but thriving, managing farms, operating businesses in small towns. The racial and social hierarchies they had been promised would make America weak, instead seemed to be contributing to strength through the mobilization of all segments of society. Wilhelm Hoffmann, watching this American landscape roll past, began keeping his own journal, hidden from the guards. His entries grew increasingly troubled. June 3rd, he wrote as the train crossed into Tennessee. Passed through a small town today, didn't catch the name. Saw a Negro man driving a new truck, eating something from a paper bag, drinking from a bottle. He was singing. I could see him through the window. Singing. In Germany, we were told these people are miserable, oppressed, starving under Jewish capitalism. But this man looked happier and healthier than anyone I knew in Hamburg before the war. What else have we been told that isn't true? I'm afraid to think about it. The train journey also exposed the prisoners to something else they hadn't expected: American kindness from ordinary citizens. At various stops where the trains paused to take on water or fuel, local people gathered to see the German prisoners. Some came with hostility, certainly, angry at the enemy who had killed American sons and brothers. But others brought things to give away: sandwiches made by church groups, apples from backyard trees, cookies baked by housewives who remembered their own German ancestry and felt compelled to feed even the enemy. One elderly woman in a small Tennessee town handed a basket of fried chicken through a train window, tears streaming down her face. Her grandson had died at Kasserine Pass, one of the first major American-German battles in North Africa. She had every reason to hate these prisoners, but she fed them anyway, explaining through an interpreter that no soldier should go hungry, that her grandson would have wanted her to do this. The prisoners who received that chicken spoke about it for months afterward, unable to reconcile such compassion with the image of Americans they had constructed. And then finally they arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, and the full weight of American abundance became undeniable. Built specifically to house German prisoners of war, Camp Hearn was one of dozens of such facilities scattered across the American Southwest and Midwest, located in areas where land was cheap, escape difficult, and labor needs high. The camp had been constructed with remarkable speed, part of the massive infrastructure expansion that characterized American mobilization. On the prisoners' first morning, June 5, 1943, they woke to revelations that would fundamentally alter their understanding of everything. The camp menu for that day was recorded in meticulous detail by American officials, part of the documentation required to demonstrate compliance with the Geneva Conventions. It would become one of the most psychologically significant documents of the war, at least for the men who experienced it. Breakfast began at 600 hours. Oatmeal, hot and creamy, served with milk and sugar that prisoners could add according to their preference. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitute that had become standard even in Germany before the war. Bacon, multiple strips per man. Pork crisped to perfection, fat dripping with calories and flavor. Toast made from white bread, soft and fresh, served with butter, real dairy butter, and jam in multiple flavors, strawberry, grape, apple. Orange juice served cold, a luxury that seemed almost obscene to men from a country that had forgotten the taste of citrus. Coffee, strong and hot, with cream and sugar available for those who wanted it. American soldiers complained that the coffee was never as good as what they got back home, but to Germans it tasted like heaven. Lunch came at noon, vegetable soup as a starter, thick with carrots, celery, onions, tomatoes, and potatoes. Roast pork as the main course, thick slices of meat with gravy, accompanied by mashed potatoes, smooth and buttery, and cooked carrots glazed with brown sugar. Bread, always more bread, and apple pie for dessert served with milk. Apple pie, a symbol of American domesticity, served to enemy soldiers. Some prisoners laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others ate their slices slowly, trying to make the experience last, unable to believe that tomorrow would bring the same abundance. Dinner arrived at 1800 hours. Fried chicken, golden and crispy, multiple pieces per man. Rice fluffy and white, not the grey, infested grain they had sometimes received in North Africa. Green beans, cooked with bacon fat, cornbread with butter, fruit salad made from canned fruit that included pineapple, a flavor most prisoners had never experienced, and coffee again for those who wanted it. The total caloric content for that single day exceeded 3,500 calories, carefully calculated by army nutritionists to meet the requirements of the Geneva Conventions while also rebuilding the health of men who had arrived severely malnourished. It was more than a German civilian received in 2 full days of rations, and infinitely better in quality. For men who had been wasting away, who had felt their bodies consuming themselves for fuel, it was almost too much to process, both psychologically and physiologically. Some prisoners ate until they vomited, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the volume of food after months of near starvation. Their bodies had adapted to deprivation, their digestive systems had slowed, their metabolism had shifted into starvation mode. Now confronted with abundance, they made themselves sick in their desperation to eat while the eating was good. Others took the opposite approach, eating slowly and carefully, hiding bread under their mattresses or in their pockets, convinced that this abundance was temporary, that tomorrow would bring a return to starvation, that this was all part of some elaborate psychological torture. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the Americans to reveal that this had all been a cruel joke, designed to make their eventual deprivation more painful. But the guards, young American soldiers themselves, amazed at the fuss the Germans were making over what seemed like normal food, laughed and told them through interpreters, "Tomorrow will be the same, and the next day, and the next. You're in America now. This is how we eat. You'll get used to it." That promise, casual and confident, was itself a form of propaganda more powerful than any poster or newsreel. It suggested that this abundance wasn't special, wasn't an exception, but was simply normal American life. For men raised in a society where scarcity had been the norm even before the war, where rationing and deprivation had been accepted as inevitable consequences of building a great nation, the suggestion that another country could feed even its enemies lavishly was profoundly destabilizing to their worldview. Over the following days and weeks, as the prisoners settled into the routine of camp life, the food continued to be a constant source of wonder and psychological transformation. Meals maintained the same level of quality and abundance, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day, with variety that kept the menu interesting. Roast beef, pork chops, ham steaks, fried fish, spaghetti with meat sauce, beef stew, meatloaf, turkey for holidays. Always accompanied by multiple vegetables, always with bread, always with desserts that ranged from pie to cake to pudding to ice cream. The prisoners began to gain weight, their bodies slowly recovering from the damage of prolonged malnutrition. Medical officers documented the improvements. Scurvy symptoms disappeared within weeks as vitamin C returned to their diets. Night vision improved with vitamin A supplementation. The protein rebuilt muscle mass. The calories restored energy. Within 3 months, the average prisoner had gained 20 to 30 pounds. Their appearance transformed from skeletal to merely thin. But the food did more than rebuild their bodies. Over time, as the initial shock faded and the prisoners accepted that this abundance wasn't going away, it began to fundamentally shatter their worldview, to dismantle the carefully constructed edifice of Nazi ideology piece by piece. They had been told that America was weak, that its society was decadent and on the verge of collapse, that its people were soft, divided by racial conflict and class warfare, unable to sustain a serious war effort. They had been told that Germany was destined to win because Germans were superior, harder, more disciplined, more willing to sacrifice for the collective good. They had been told that the German way of life, austere and militarized, was not just necessary but morally correct, that abundance and comfort made people weak and unworthy. They had been told all of this, had believed it with the fervor of true believers, had been willing to die for these principles. And now, sitting in a Texas prison camp, being fed better than Wehrmacht officers back home, being cared for better than German civilians, they were forced to confront the possibility that everything they had been told was a lie. The camp canteen provided another daily reminder of American abundance and another blow to Nazi ideology. Prisoners were paid for labor they performed in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, which stipulated that prisoner labor must be compensated. The wages were modest by American standards, typically 80 cents per day for enlisted men, higher for those with specialized skills. To prisoners who had been paid in increasingly worthless Reichsmarks, any wages seemed generous. But more significantly, those wages could be spent at the camp canteen, a small store stocked with items that had disappeared from Germany years earlier. Chocolate bars, dozens of different varieties, more chocolate than most prisoners had seen in a lifetime. Razor blades, actual steel blades that were sharp and effective, not the dull, reused scraps that had been standard in the Wehrmacht. Soap, real soap that lathered and cleaned, not the synthetic substitutes made from coal derivatives that had become standard in Germany. Writing paper and envelopes, allowing prisoners to correspond with family back home. Cigarettes, American cigarettes, smooth and well-made compared to the harsh tobacco that German soldiers had smoked when they could get any at all. And most incredibly, impossibly, ice cream. At Camp Hearn alone, prisoners bought 5,000 ice cream bars every week, purchased from the canteen at 5 cents apiece. Ice cream, that frivolous luxury, that symbol of peacetime prosperity, available to enemy prisoners in unlimited quantities, while Germany hadn't produced ice cream for civilian consumption since 1941. One prisoner, Franz Becker, wrote home about this in a letter that somehow made it through the censors. Yesterday, he wrote to his sister in Berlin, "I bought ice cream. I stood in line at the canteen with my wages from working in the camp garden, and I bought ice cream, vanilla flavor, cold and sweet. In Germany, even party officials cannot get ice cream. My officers told me before I was captured that America was starving, that their civilians were rioting for food, that their soldiers were deserting because they weren't being fed. But here, Enemy prisoners buy ice cream for 5 cents. Greta, I don't understand anything anymore. Nothing makes sense. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? Letters like Franz Becker's were exactly what American authorities had hoped for, though they would never have admitted it publicly. The policy of feeding prisoners well was officially justified through the Geneva Conventions, through humanitarian principles, through the desire to ensure that German authorities would treat American prisoners equally well in return. But it was also, quite deliberately, a form of psychological warfare. Every letter that made it back to Germany, describing the abundance in American camps, undermined Nazi propaganda. Every prisoner who returned home after the war with stories of how well they had been treated became a living refutation of Nazi ideology. The investment in feeding prisoners well, which cost the American government a tiny fraction of its war budget, paid dividends in shaping German perceptions that would last for generations. The prisoners' work assignments provided yet another daily exposure to American abundance, taking them outside the camp's barbed wire and into the heart of American agricultural and industrial production. In accordance with the Geneva Conventions, officers could not be compelled to work, but enlisted men could be assigned labor duties, and most camps put prisoners to work in ways that both benefited the American economy and gave prisoners something constructive to do. The alternative, sitting idle in camp for years, would have been psychologically devastating. Instead, prisoners worked on farms, at meat packing plants, in dairies, at sugar factories, in logging operations, and in dozens of other industries facing labor shortages as American men went off to war. Every workplace became another classroom in American abundance, another lesson in the gulf between Nazi propaganda and reality. Working on farms, German prisoners witnessed agricultural mechanization on a scale that was unimaginable in Europe. American farms had been mechanized since before the war, with tractors, combine harvesters, mechanical planters, and other equipment that replaced human labor with machine power. One prisoner wrote home describing a single farm in Kansas that was larger than his entire village back in Saxony, worked by one family with the help of 3 massive tractors and various specialized equipment. The farmer, a man in his 60s whose sons were away at war, directed the German prisoners in their work with good humor and fairness. At lunchtime, the farmer's wife brought food, thick sandwiches on fresh bread, fried chicken, potato salad, pie, thermoses of coffee with cream. The German prisoners watched as the farmer and his wife, along with the African-American day laborers also employed on the farm, all ate together, sharing the same abundant food, sitting in the shade of the barn and talking about the weather and the crops. The African-Americans, whom Nazi ideology had declared suitable only for slavery, ate meals that would have been feasts in Germany, laughing and joking with the white farmer as equals, at least at the lunch table if not in broader society. At meatpacking plants, the sheer scale of American animal agriculture became visible. Prisoners working at facilities in Texas and Nebraska watched as cattle were processed by the thousands, entire trainloads of livestock arriving daily, being slaughtered, butchered, and packed for shipment to American forces across the globe and to Allied nations through Lend-Lease. More meat moved through a single plant in a week than Bavaria saw in a year. The prisoners learned that even with this massive production, Americans at home complained about meat rationing, about having to make do with 2 pounds of beef per week per person, a quantity that would have seemed lavish in Germany, where civilians were lucky to get a quarter pound of horse meat per month. At dairies, prisoners witnessed what seemed like criminal waste from their perspective. Milk was produced in such quantities that quality standards could be maintained at levels unimaginable in Europe. Milk that wasn't perfectly fresh, that was even slightly past its peak, was poured out as fertilizer rather than being sent to market. Prisoners watched gallons of milk, milk that German children desperately needed, being poured onto fields to enrich the soil. One prisoner, a farmer's son from Holstein who understood dairy production, wrote about this with something approaching horror. "They throw away more milk than we produce," he wrote. "The waste would feed my village for a month. But to them, it's nothing, just the cost of maintaining quality. What kind of country can afford this?" Sugar factories provided another shocking revelation. Prisoners working at sugar processing facilities in Louisiana and Texas watched American workers pour half a cup of sugar into their coffee during breaks, stirring it carelessly, sometimes dumping out half-finished cups that contained more sugar than a German family's 2-month ration. 2 months of carefully hoarded sweetness, gone in one discarded drink. The prisoners learned that sugar was rationed in America, that civilians were limited in how much they could purchase, but the limits were so generous by German standards that they seemed like abundance rather than restriction. American housewives complained about having to make do with just a few pounds of sugar per month, apparently unaware that German civilians received barely a few ounces in the same period. Through all of these experiences, working in American agriculture and industry, the prisoners encountered a consistent pattern that challenged everything they had been taught about racial ideology and social organization. African Americans, whom Nazi propaganda had portrayed as the bottom tier of a collapsing society, worked alongside white Americans in most facilities. While racial segregation was certainly real in 1940s America, particularly in the South where most prison camps were located, and while discrimination was endemic and systematic, the prisoners nonetheless observed black Americans operating complex machinery, earning wages, buying goods at stores, driving vehicles, and generally participating in American prosperity at a level that contradicted the Nazi narrative of racial hierarchy leading to national weakness. Some prisoners, particularly those who had been deeply indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology, struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they believed. Others began to question whether their entire understanding of race and society had been wrong. Women's participation in the American workforce provided another ideological challenge. Nazi ideology had emphasized traditional gender roles, confining women primarily to the home as mothers and homemakers, to the kitchen, church, and children, as the slogan went. German women had been mobilized for war work only reluctantly and late in the conflict, as manpower shortages became desperate. But in America, the prisoners saw women everywhere in the workforce, not as a sign of desperation, but as a deliberate mobilization of national capacity. Women operated cranes at docks, drove trucks, worked in factories, managed farms, ran businesses while their husbands and sons fought overseas. And they did all of this while still maintaining their families, raising children, and participating in community life. Far from weakening American society, this mobilization of women seemed to be making it stronger, more productive, more resilient. The letters that trickled back to Germany from the camps carried all of these observations, filtered through censorship, but still powerful in their impact. American censors read every letter, blocking any information that might have military value, but they generally allowed descriptions of camp conditions and prisoner treatment to pass through. This was deliberate policy. The American government wanted word of good treatment to reach Germany, hoping it would encourage better treatment of American prisoners and also undermine German morale. German censors also read the letters before distributing them to families, and they too faced a dilemma. Blocking all mail from prisoners would be psychologically devastating to families desperate for news of their loved ones. But allowing the letters through meant allowing descriptions of American abundance to circulate in a Germany that was growing more desperate with each passing month. Some prisoners, aware of how their letters might affect their families, tried to spare them the pain of knowing how well they were being fed, while families back home starved. These men lied in their letters, understating the abundance, describing conditions as merely adequate rather than generous. Others wrote honestly, compelled by a need to process their own confusion and cognitive dissonance, needing to share with their families the profound disorientation of discovering that everything they had believed was false. One letter that slipped through both American and German censors, written by a prisoner named Hans Weber to his wife Greta in Hamburg, captured this psychological transformation with particular poignancy. "My beloved Greta," Hans wrote in November 1943, 6 months into his captivity, "I am well fed here. Please do not worry about me, though I know from the Red Cross that things are difficult at home. The Americans have more food than they know what to do with. I write this not to cause you pain, but because I need you to understand what I am learning. Everything we were told was a lie. America is not weak. It is not collapsing. It is not divided and falling apart. I see with my own eyes every day a country so strong, so rich in resources, that it can feed its enemies better than we could feed our own soldiers. I understand now why they fight. They are not fighting because they are forced to, not fighting because they fear their leaders, not fighting for Lebensraum or racial purity, or any of the things we were told mattered. They are fighting to protect what they have, and Greta, what they have is paradise compared to what we knew. I am not sure what this means for us, for Germany, for our future, but I know that we cannot win this war. No nation that throws away more than we produce can be defeated by a nation that is starving. I will come home to you when this is over, if God permits, but I will come home a different man than the one who left. I have seen the truth, and I cannot unsee it. Letters like Hans Weber's circulated through German society in complicated ways. Official channels tried to suppress the most damaging accounts, but families shared letters with relatives and friends, and word spread through informal networks. The impact was gradual but significant. As 1943 turned into 1944, and as more prisoners were captured on the Italian front, in France after D-Day, and eventually in Germany itself, the number of men who had experienced American captivity grew. Each one became a potential carrier of information that contradicted Nazi propaganda. The regime tried to counter this with stories of brutality in Soviet camps, which were entirely true, and with claims that the American treatment was a propaganda trick that would end as soon as the war was over. But the evidence was hard to dismiss. Prisoners came home after the war healthier than they had left, having gained weight in captivity rather than losing it, having received dental and medical care that improved their condition rather than degraded it. As months turned into years for the prisoners in camps across America, the transformation became complete in ways that went beyond physical health or intellectual understanding. The abundance they experienced began to reshape their fundamental assumptions about how society could be organized, about what was possible, about what kind of world they wanted to build after the war. By the time Thanksgiving arrived in November 1943, followed by Christmas in December, events that the Americans celebrated with special enthusiasm and traditional meals, the psychological shift was undeniable. Thanksgiving was a peculiarly American holiday, unknown in Germany, and the prisoners initially had no context for understanding it. American camp commanders explained through interpreters that it was a day of giving thanks for blessings and abundance, a harvest festival transformed into a national tradition. The prisoners found the concept strange, but were unprepared for the meal itself. Turkey, massive roasted birds, dozens of them, more poultry than most prisoners had seen in one place, stuffing made from bread, herbs and sausage, mashed potatoes with gravy, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, a combination that baffled German palates, cranberry sauce, tart and sweet, green beans, corn, rolls with butter, and for dessert, pumpkin pie, another peculiarly American creation that most prisoners had never encountered. The meal was abundant, even by the standards they had grown accustomed to in the camps, and it came with an explanation that this was how Americans celebrated, that families across the country were eating similar meals, that this abundance was being shared by hundreds of millions of people. Christmas brought even more profound cultural dissonance. In Germany, Christmas had been appropriated by the Nazi regime, stripped of much of its Christian significance, and transformed into a celebration of German cultural heritage and racial identity. The prisoners expected nothing from the Americans beyond perhaps a day off from work. What they received instead was shocking. Christmas packages, assembled by American church groups and civic organizations, delivered to enemy prisoners out of a combination of Christian charity and calculated psychological warfare. The packages contained candy, cigarettes, soap, playing cards, small toys, practical items, and notes of goodwill from American families who felt compelled to reach out even to the enemy. Christmas dinner featured ham and roast beef, multiple starches, vegetables, pies and cakes, and an atmosphere of celebration that camp commanders encouraged as a way to maintain morale and reinforce the message of American generosity. Some prisoners were moved to tears by the gesture, unable to reconcile such kindness with their image of the enemy. Others became angry, feeling humiliated by the charity, resentful that they needed it, troubled by the cognitive dissonance between what they were experiencing and what they wanted to believe about the war. But all of them were affected. Christmas 1943 in American prison camps became a turning point for thousands of German soldiers, the moment when the ideology of German superiority collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. If Germany was superior, why were its enemies feeding its soldiers better than Germany could? If German organization and discipline were the ultimate expression of national strength, why did American abundance, born from a messier, more democratic, more diverse society, so thoroughly surpass anything Germany could achieve? The psychological impact manifested in different ways across the prisoner population. Hardcore Nazis, and there were certainly committed ideologues among the prisoners, rejected what they were seeing, constructing elaborate rationalizations to explain away the evidence. They claimed the abundance was temporary, that America was exhausting itself and would collapse. They insisted that the good treatment was a trick, propaganda designed to weaken German will. They argued that America's strength came from exploiting other nations, from Jewish financial manipulation, from any explanation that would preserve their worldview. Some of these men organized resistance within the camps, intimidating prisoners who spoke favorably about America, maintaining military discipline and Nazi hierarchy even in captivity, threatening those who seemed too willing to accept American generosity. But they were fighting a losing battle against the evidence of daily experience. The majority of prisoners, men who had joined the Wehrmacht out of patriotic duty or conscription rather than ideological fervor, found their beliefs eroding under the relentless exposure to abundance. These men began to question not just specific claims about America, but the entire framework of Nazi ideology. If they had been wrong about American weakness, what else had they been wrong about? If abundance came from democracy and diversity rather than from racial purity and authoritarian control, what did that mean for Germany's future? These questions had no easy answers, and many prisoners spent their years of captivity wrestling with them, trying to reconcile their past beliefs with their present reality, trying to imagine what kind of Germany they wanted to return to when the war finally ended. Educational programs in the camps, officially focused on teaching English and providing vocational training, became subtle vehicles for democratic re-education. American authorities, thinking ahead to the post-war period, wanted prisoners to return to Germany with positive impressions of American democracy, and perhaps with some understanding of how democratic systems functioned. These programs were voluntary, and hardcore Nazis refused to participate, but many prisoners enrolled out of boredom if nothing else. They learned English from American teachers, many of them conscientious objectors serving alternative duty, who brought their own perspectives on American society. They took classes in agriculture, mechanics, carpentry, and other trades that would be useful in rebuilding post-war Germany. And in the process, they were exposed to American ideas about individual liberty, democratic governance, civil society, and market economics. The camp libraries, stocked with German language books and American books translated into German, provided another avenue for ideological transformation. Prisoners could read, many for the first time, books that had been banned in Nazi Germany. Works of literature, philosophy, and political theory that presented alternatives to fascist ideology. Books about American history, explaining how the United States had developed, how its democratic institutions functioned, how its diverse population had been forged into a unified nation. The act of reading such books was itself a form of rebellion against Nazi thought control, and many prisoners discovered in those pages ideas that resonated more deeply than the propaganda they had been fed. Interactions with American guards and camp personnel provided daily lessons in democratic culture. American soldiers, young men mostly in their late teens and early 20s, treated the prisoners with a casual informality that shocked Germans accustomed to rigid military hierarchy. Guards would chat with prisoners during work details, sharing cigarettes, talking about sports or women or their hometowns, treating the Germans as fellow human beings rather than as ideological enemies. This informality extended up the chain of command. Camp commanders, often reserve officers called up from civilian life, ran their facilities with a combination of military discipline and civilian sensibility. They enforced rules, but also listened to prisoner complaints, made adjustments when problems arose, and generally treated the prisoners as men who deserved basic dignity and respect. This approach was not universal, certainly. Some camps were run more harshly, some guards were cruel or indifferent, and incidents of mistreatment occurred. The American system was imperfect, marked by the racial segregation that kept black soldiers from guarding white prisoners in many camps, by occasional outbursts of violence against prisoners suspected of war crimes, by the same human failings that affected any large-scale enterprise. But on the whole, the treatment of German prisoners in American camps was remarkably humane by the standards of World War II, far better than the treatment of Allied prisoners in German camps, and incomparably better than the horrific conditions in Soviet captivity. This relative humanity was itself a form of propaganda, demonstrating that democratic societies could wage total war while still respecting basic human rights. As 1944 progressed and the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, news from home grew increasingly grim for the prisoners. Letters from family members described worsening conditions, intensified bombing, food shortages that had moved beyond severe into catastrophic. The contrast between what prisoners were experiencing in America and what their families endured in Germany created profound guilt for many men. They were safe, well-fed and comfortable, while their loved ones faced destruction and starvation. This guilt complicated their psychological transformation. They couldn't fully embrace their new understanding of American strength without feeling like they were betraying their families, their comrades still fighting their nation. The cognitive dissonance was painful and unresolvable. The news of D-Day in June 1944 reached the camps through official channels and through American newspapers that prisoners could access. For hardcore Nazis, the Allied invasion of France was proof that Germany still faced determined enemies and must fight harder. But for many others, D-Day marked the beginning of the end. They had seen American productive capacity firsthand. They had witnessed the abundance of material, the endless flow of supplies, the casual confidence of a nation that knew it could outproduce any enemy. When they learned of the scale of the Normandy invasion, the thousands of ships and aircraft, the hundreds of thousands of troops, they understood that Germany was facing an avalanche it could not stop. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but when, and what would be left of their country when it did. News of the attempted assassination of Hitler in July 1944 and its failure produced complex reactions in the camps. Some prisoners, particularly those who had grown disillusioned with Nazi leadership, hoped that Hitler's death might bring a negotiated end to the war and spare Germany further destruction. Others remained loyal to the Führer, viewing the assassination attempt as treacherous betrayal. The failure of the plot and the brutal purge that followed reinforced the sense that Germany was locked into a course that could only end in total defeat. Prisoners debated these events intensely, sometimes violently, as the ideological divisions within the camps sharpened. The final months of 1944 and early 1945 brought increasingly desperate news from Germany. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, briefly raised hopes among Nazi loyalists that the tide might turn. But prisoners who understood American logistics knew better. They had seen the reserves of men and material available to the Americans. They knew that even a temporary setback would be quickly overcome. When the offensive failed and Allied forces resumed their advance into Germany from both east and west, the end became inevitable. The revelation of the concentration camps, as American and British forces liberated Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen and Dachau in the spring of 1945, created a different kind of crisis for prisoners. News of the camps reached America through newspapers and radio broadcasts, and camp authorities made sure prisoners had access to this information. Photographs of skeletal survivors, of mass graves, of gas chambers and crematoria were posted on bulletin boards, shown in mandatory viewings of newsreels. American authorities wanted prisoners to confront what had been done in their name, to understand that the regime they had served was not just militarily defeated, but morally monstrous. Reactions varied dramatically. Some prisoners refused to believe the evidence, insisting it was propaganda, that the photographs were faked, that the stories were exaggerated. These men clung to their ideology even as it crumbled around them. Others were genuinely shocked, claiming they had no knowledge of such atrocities, that the Wehrmacht was separate from the SS, that they had fought honorably and bore no responsibility for crimes committed by others. Some of these claims were sincere, some were convenient deflections. The truth was complex. Many regular Wehrmacht soldiers genuinely had no knowledge of the extermination camps, which were operated by the SS and hidden from the general population and military. But the Wehrmacht had been deeply complicit in numerous war crimes, particularly on the Eastern Front, and the claim of total ignorance was often more comfortable than true. A smaller number of prisoners confronted the evidence honestly and felt crushing guilt. These men had fought for a regime that had committed unprecedented evil. The fact that they personally had not participated in the worst crimes did not absolve them of serving the system that made those crimes possible. For some, this guilt became unbearable. Camp authorities reported increased incidents of depression and suicide attempts in the spring of 1945 as prisoners grappled with the moral weight of what had been revealed. The psychological journey from proud German soldier to man confronting the reality of Nazi evil was devastating, and not everyone survived it intact. The end of the war in Europe, marked by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, brought relief and new uncertainty to the camps. The fighting was over. Prisoners would eventually go home. But what kind of Germany would they return to? News from occupied Germany painted a picture of total devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or displaced, the country divided among occupying powers, food supplies catastrophically inadequate. The Germany they would return to bore little resemblance to the country they had left. Some prisoners, comfortable in American captivity, well-fed and safe, were in no hurry to return to that devastation. Others were desperate to get home to search for surviving family members and begin rebuilding their lives. Repatriation was a complex process that unfolded over several years. High-risk prisoners, those identified as committed Nazis or suspected war criminals, were held longer and subjected to more intensive screening. Others were released in waves based on complicated criteria involving labor needs, security assessments, and diplomatic negotiations. The process was slow and often arbitrary, creating frustration and anger among prisoners eager to return home. But eventually, most prisoners made the journey back, carrying with them not just their personal belongings, but memories of American abundance that would shape their perspectives for the rest of their lives. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the soldier who had sat in that Texas mess hall in June 1943, unable to believe the food before him, returned to Germany in late 1946. His mother had survived the war, though their home in Hamburg had been destroyed by Allied bombing. She was living in the basement of a partially collapsed building, surviving on aid from Allied relief organizations and what she could scavenge. When Wilhelm first saw her, he was shocked by how thin she was, how aged she appeared, though only 5 years had passed. She was shocked by how healthy he looked, how strong, how well his years as a prisoner had treated him physically, even as they had troubled him psychologically. They had a difficult reunion, complicated by guilt and relief, and the vast gap between their wartime experiences. She had endured years of bombing, starvation, and terror, while he had been safe and well-fed in America. He struggled to explain what he had experienced, how his understanding of the world had changed, what he now believed about the war and Germany's future. In the months and years after returning home, Wilhelm Hoffmann and hundreds of thousands of former prisoners like him became informal ambassadors of American abundance. They talked about what they had experienced, describing the food, the treatment, the wealth they had witnessed. In a Germany struggling to rebuild from total defeat, where millions were on the edge of starvation, where the black market was the only reliable source of adequate food, these stories of American plenty were both inspiring and demoralizing. They suggested that recovery was possible, that prosperity could be rebuilt, but also that Germany had been so thoroughly outmatched that defeat had been inevitable. The stories contributed to a broader cultural shift in post-war Germany, a rejection of militarism and authoritarianism, an embrace of democracy and market economics, a desire to become more like the Western societies that had defeated them. This transformation was not immediate or universal. Many Germans, particularly older generations, and those who had been most invested in Nazi ideology never fully accepted the lessons of defeat. They blamed the loss on betrayal, on overwhelming numbers, on anything except the fundamental weaknesses of the Nazi system. But among the younger generation, among those who had served in the military and experienced the realities of the war rather than just the propaganda, change was possible. Former prisoners brought back not just stories of abundance, but also, in many cases, a commitment to building a different kind of Germany, one based on democratic principles and peaceful prosperity rather than military conquest and racial ideology. The American policy of treating prisoners well paid long-term dividends in ways that were impossible to quantify precisely, but were nonetheless real. Former prisoners who had positive experiences in American camps became, in many cases, advocates for Western democracy, supporters of German integration into Western institutions, voices for reconciliation rather than revenge. As West Germany rebuilt in the late 1940s and 1950s, becoming an economic powerhouse through the combination of Marshall Plan aid, democratic governance and social market economics, the memories of American abundance in POW camps served as a reference point, a proof that prosperity and democracy were compatible, that German recovery was possible. The contrast with soldiers who had been captured by the Soviets was stark and served to reinforce the lessons learned in American camps. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces, and nearly 1/3 of them died in captivity, victims of starvation, disease, forced labor, and deliberate brutality. Soviet camps were nightmares of deprivation that made even the worst conditions in Africa seem mild by comparison. Prisoners who survived Soviet captivity, many of them not released until the mid-1950s, returned to Germany as broken men, physically devastated and psychologically traumatized. The comparison between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners became a powerful argument for West German alignment with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. Germans who had experienced both systems knew which one treated human beings with dignity and which one treated them as expendable resources. Cultural memory of the POW experience in America became part of the broader German reckoning with World War II. Books and memoirs published in the decades after the war, oral histories collected by researchers, documentaries and films all explored the experience of German prisoners in America. The consistent theme was surprise at American generosity and the psychological impact of discovering that Nazi propaganda had been fundamentally dishonest. One of the most commonly quoted sentiments from former prisoners, repeated in dozens of accounts, was the realization expressed by Hans Schmidt, a former corporal who spent 3 years in American camps. "We surrendered to abundance long before we surrendered to Eisenhower." That line captured something essential about the experience, the idea that the war had been lost not just militarily, but ideologically, that German soldiers had been defeated by their recognition of American strength before they were defeated by American armies. The story of German prisoners of war in America is ultimately a story about the power of prosperity as a form of soft power, about how material abundance can achieve what military force alone cannot. The United States could have treated prisoners harshly, could have provided only minimal food and care, could have sought revenge for American casualties. Such treatment would have been understandable given the context of total war, and it would have satisfied desires for punishment of the enemy. But American authorities, guided by a combination of humanitarian principles, diplomatic calculation, and strategic foresight, chose instead to treat prisoners well, to feed them generously, to demonstrate through daily practice the prosperity and strength that came from democratic governance and market economics. This choice had costs, certainly. American taxpayers funded the imprisonment and feeding of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Resources devoted to POW camps could have been used elsewhere. Some Americans objected to the policy, arguing that the enemy deserved harsher treatment. But the long-term benefits justified the investment. German prisoners returned home as witnesses to American prosperity, as living proof that democracy and abundance were compatible, as advocates for Western values in a Germany that needed to find a new path forward. In the ideological struggle that would define the post-war world, the struggle between democratic capitalism and authoritarian communism, These former prisoners became assets, men whose personal experiences had taught them which system better served human flourishing. The contrast between Nazi promises and American reality was too stark to dismiss. Germany had promised greatness through conquest, prosperity through the seizure of Lebensraum, strength through racial purity and authoritarian control. Instead, it had delivered poverty, defeat, and moral catastrophe. America, dismissed by Nazi propaganda as weak and decadent, had demonstrated strength through diversity, prosperity through democracy, and moral authority through its treatment even of enemies. For men like Wilhelm Hoffmann, sitting in that Texas mess hall in 1943, staring at a plate of food that seemed impossible, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Everything they had believed was challenged by the simple reality of abundance, and once that crack appeared in their ideology, it spread and widened until the entire edifice collapsed. This is the untold story of World War II, the story of how food became a weapon, how abundance defeated ideology, how the simple act of feeding enemy soldiers helped transform German society and lay the groundwork for post-war reconciliation. It's a reminder that military history is not just about battles and campaigns, but also about logistics and resources, about the home front and civilian life, about the ways that material conditions shape human psychology and political possibility. The German prisoners who experienced American abundance in the 1940s became witnesses to a truth that Nazi propaganda had tried to hide. The truth that prosperity comes not from conquest, but from productive capacity, not from racial hierarchy, but from the mobilization of all human potential, not from authoritarian control, but from the freedom and creativity that democracy enables. That truth, learned at a mess hall table in Texas, helped shape the Germany that emerged from the ruins of war, a Germany committed to peace, democracy, and integration with the West. And it all started with a plate of food that seemed too good to be true.